Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our next session on suffering and the Christian life. This is number 4. And today I want to talk a little bit about the subject of life after death. What does it mean when we think of the afterlife? What does it mean when we think of heaven? And one of the reasons I want to talk about this is because whenever we have a discussion about suffering or human tragedy, kind of alongside of that discussion for many people is the belief or the notion of what we would call an afterlife. Sometimes believing in life after death is what allows some people to endure or put up with a tremendous amount of suffering or even injustice. So sometimes the suffering that we allow, or sometimes the suffering that we put up with, we do so because we're believing that there's something great and glorious on the other side. Sometimes our belief in the afterlife or in heaven is really nothing more than just kind of being sentimental. And you can find that in a lot of our hymns, a lot of our praise songs that kind of talk about heaven in a very sentimental fashion. I've noticed in my own life that the older I get, and I think this is probably common of a lot of people, the older I get, the more sentimental I get. I've told this story many times over the years, but when I was younger, which doesn't seem that long ago, when I was kind of in my tween years, I guess, kind of 11 years old or 12 years old, my brother and I would frequently be babysitted by my grandmother on my mom's side. Her name was Mabel. And we would often, so my dad would be at work, my mom would be at work, and then we had a set of cousins who also lived in the area, and their parents had to go to work. So oftentimes my grandma Mabel would come down, come down all the way from North Dakota, and she would babysit us grandkids for a week or maybe for 2 weeks. And so it'd be four grandkids all in the same house trying to entertain ourselves. And while our parents were at work. Well, one thing that kind of came out of that was my grandma Mabel had a very distinct preference when it came to music style. There was only one radio channel that the living room stereo was going to be tuned to. And I could even remember to this day that the radio channel was KTIS. I think it was 98.1 on the FM dial there in the Twin Cities. And that channel mainly played Bill Gaither and Gloria Gaither, and then it also played Jimmy Swaggart. And if you know those names, those are kind of famous names of what you might call the old Southern gospel style of music. And my dear grandmother, God bless her, she's been gone for a while now, but she had every single album I think that Jimmy Swaggart or Bill Gaither ever produced. And she would play those records over and over and over. And needless to say, it was not music that young teenage boys necessarily were influenced. I can even remember when Jimmy Swaggart kind of had his fall from grace, or his sinful episode with a member of the female persuasion. My grandmother was so traumatized, I thought she was going to stop going to church for good. But fortunately, she held on to her faith despite that tragic situation. And now that I think about it, Jimmy Swaggart was the cousin, now that I think about it, of Jerry Lee Lewis, who wrote the famous song "Great Balls of Fire." So a lot of music in that family. Anyways, I can remember, thinking to myself as a kid, having to listen to that music all day long, getting bored with it. I remember telling myself, I am never going to listen to this music when I grow up. When I get old enough, when I'm old enough to drive, when I'm an adult, when I have a home and a family of my own, I am not going to subject my kids to this kind of music. Now, guess what? Now I have 4 kids. I have a car that has a lot of different radio stations on it. And guess when we're in the car with the kids, or I'm taking them to school or picking them up to school, guess what we're listening to in the car? It's the best of the Bill Gaither vocal band. So that's kind of a humbling admission for me, to admit that something that I didn't like years ago is now something that I've become so conditioned over time that now I practice the same thing that I didn't like as a kid. So it's a good example of how we become more sentimental over time, and the things we didn't think we valued as kids or young people now suddenly become more important to us as adults. So that's kind of my big example of becoming sentimental as I get older. Well, in our discussion of heaven and in the discussion of the afterlife, I think there's a lot of sentimentality built into it, but I think there's also some legitimate questions that come to us in our human experience. And this isn't just within the Christian experience. I think we see this in other cultures as well. But it's almost as though ingrained in every human, there's kind of a demand for a continuity or a continuation of personal existence. In the book of Job chapter 14, he asks this question. He says, if a man dies, will he live again? And the irony is that it's really not just Job that asks that question. It's people from every time in history, from every culture, who have asked basically the same question. And many different religions, many different cultures have all had this idea of the afterlife. One of the things I enjoy reading about and studying is different mythologies from different cultures, whether it's like Greek mythology or if it's Norwegian mythology. And in Norwegian mythology, the Vikings had this place of heaven called Valhalla, which is where you could only get there if you died in battle. So the greatest reward or the greatest hope for any Viking in those days, kind of in the Middle Ages, was to die in warfare, was to die in battle. And that was kind of an assurance that they would go to Valhalla, where they had this place where every night was kind of feasting and drinking for all eternity. It doesn't sound like they can come up with any other ideas than getting drunk. In Native American culture, in American Indian culture, you have kind of this concept of the afterlife, which was this idea of a happy hunting ground where, the herds of buffalo never ran out. There was never a scarcity of wildlife. There was never a lack of things to hunt. And the buffalo herds were just gigantic and enormous, and they never wandered off too far. So there was always something easy to hunt. And Christianity, of course, is no different. We have our own concept of the afterlife that's given to us in the pages of the Bible. And so just like all these other cultures, we think that there's some type of continuation. There's a continuity of our personal existence. Now our bodies may cease to function. Our organs, our hearts and lungs may cease to function, but and even to a degree our brains may cease to function, but there's something about us. There's part of our personal existence that we think still goes on in a significant way. And sometimes we see this question asked in a very poetic way. I'm going to kind of list out a few examples of both from the Bible and from outside the Bible. But one of the most famous questions that comes to us from the pen of Shakespeare himself was in his drama called Hamlet, where he uttered those, young Prince Hamlet, who is the Prince of Denmark, utters those famous words where he says, "To be or not to be, that is the question." And so he's asking a question about, is it better to continue to exist? Is that the question? Or the other thing that he's contemplating is suicide. Is suicide kind of the great answer? And in the play, in Shakespeare's work, he kind of goes back and forth between these two extremes. Is it better to kill yourself? Or is it better to go on existing even though you might have to continue suffering in your own existence? And he talks about all these different feelings that he has about what he should do. And when somebody wonders, has these kind of conflicts, has these feelings that are in contradiction with each other, they're wondering really about the meaning of life, and especially the meaning of life in the midst of suffering, and sometimes in the midst of suffering that doesn't seem to really have an end to it. Sometimes we experience so much pain and tragedy, and we wonder sometimes if it would be better better not to even be born at all, or better not to exist at all. And it does seem that at times that life has sometimes more failures or more tragedy to it than success. It seems like there's more pain than pleasure, or more loss than gain. But despite all that, how, we can, as Christians, I think, see how people will fight tooth and nail sometimes just for a few more minutes or even a few more days to cling on to this life. And sometimes people will go to unusual extremes just to continue that fight, to continue having a few more days or maybe a few more weeks or even a few more minutes of existence with their loved ones. So, I think for most people, we would rather bear the ills of suffering that we know rather than to venture into some area where we don't know. Despite all the pain that we have in our lives, we have something in us that wants to keep hanging on. Hamlet, when he was kind of going through his dilemma, he was puzzled by the fact that he didn't know necessarily what was on the other side of death. If you know that play or know any of Shakespeare, he referred to the other side of death as the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler ever returns. And so he was admitting that he didn't know, if he kills himself, if he commits suicide, he was admitting that he didn't know what's on the other side. And the reason you don't know what's on the other side is because everyone who's ever died, they don't come back. You don't come back from that journey. And anybody whoever steps across that threshold in this world, we really don't know. We don't know what happens to them because they don't come back, except for Jesus, of course. And so his words are the only thing we have to go on. And so that, maybe Hamlet's dilemma kind of makes cowards of all of us. And, so we have this idea of those who are approaching, individuals who are approaching death. There seems to be kind of a sense of fear. And then along with that, we have people who are sometimes accompanying those who are towards death. There seems to be kind of a fear or a sense of upcoming loss. Another character who I've talked about this scenario, I've talked about him before, but probably the most famous philosopher to ever live was a Greek philosopher whose name was Socrates. His most famous student was Plato, of course, who probably wrote the most. But Socrates was really kind of the one who got the ball rolling when it comes to Western thinking and Western philosophy. And his students, mainly his most famous student, Plato, tells the story of his death. And it's also portrayed in a very famous painting that kind of describes this scene. And if you don't know the story, Socrates is condemned to death. He's condemned to die. And his friends, all of his students, all of his friends come to see him kind of in the last 24 hours. And they're coming to try and give him some encouragement. And in the picture and in the story, in the painting and in the story, his friends are the ones who are very distraught. They're just miserable that their dear teacher, their dear friend is being put to death. And they're so sad about what's happening. But Socrates, in the middle of all this, he's the picture of being calm and collected. He's not emotional. He's not sad about what's going to happen. He's the picture of complete confidence. I mean, he's totally in control, and he's completely confident. When you look at the painting, it almost looks like he's happy about what's going to happen. And his students, who are around him, they can't quite understand why, how could somebody be so happy when they're facing death that is very imminent and that is very certain. And so they can't understand why he's joyful or confident, even though he's in the last day of his life. And then it's in that context that he begins to, again, according to Plato, he begins to teach them kind of about the study of science and of nature. And he says that his study of science and nature has convinced him that this isn't the last day of his life. He believes, even though he doesn't really have a Christian perspective, he believes that there's an existence. There's a life that's after this life that we have here and now. There's an existence. There's a place where we exist for eternity, and that place is better than even the greatest things, the greatest existence we have right here and now. So in a sense, it's kind of a story about comfort. Another speaking of philosophers, another great philosopher in the 19th century, Immanuel Kant, basically said this: if there's no life after death, then this life that we have now is meaningless. Let me say that again, because that's kind of a point that's, I think, is important to drive home, especially in our culture today. He says, if there's no life after death, in other words, if there's no heaven, then the life that we have right now doesn't have any meaning. Now, I think that's important because there's a new kind of a strand or a new slight nuance to this idea that's going around kind of in what I would call academic circles in the 20th and 21st century, that goes something like this. They'll say, and every college kid in America right now is fed this baloney. And it goes something like this: if there's no meaning at the beginning of your life, the beginning of your life is absolutely meaningless. You're nothing more than just a cosmic accident, a blob of protoplasm. And that's how, those groups, those liberal groups, can justify things like abortion. Okay, if there's no meaning at the beginning of your life, if there's no meaning to your conception, then abortion is a very, very easy thing to swallow. It's very easy to allow. And then on the other hand, they also say that the end of your life is also meaningless. In other words, there's no heaven, there's nothing to look forward to. Once you die, that's it, it's game over. And that's also how you can justify things like euthanasia as well, where you're taking life before it's really over. And so there's no meaning at the beginning of your life. There's no real meaning at the end of your life, such as heaven. But then they try and convince us that in the middle, in the here and now, between those two extremes, those two poles, you can find, sometimes great meaning and great significance right here and right now in your own life. Now, friends, I just gotta say this. That is a bunch of nonsense. That is baloney. If I wasn't a minister, I'd use some stronger language. Because if the beginning of your life, it has no meaning, and the end of your life has no meaning, then guess what? You have no meaning. You can't have it both ways. Academics and philosophers who try to teach this idea are basically trying to have their cake and eat it too. But if there's no significance at the beginning of your life, in other words, God has nothing to do with the beginning of your life. If there's no significance at the end of your life, in other words, God has nothing to do with what happens to you at the end. He has nothing to do with redemption and eternity and judgment. Then guess what? Your life is insignificant. Okay, there's no reason to hope for any type of meaning and any type of existence if there's no God. If God's not at the beginning, if he's not at the end, then you're kind of out of luck. Recently, I was asked a question kind of on this subject, but it was a question about the Holocaust. And the Holocaust happened kind of in conjunction with World War II. And the question kind of went like, and you could ask it about the Holocaust or all kinds of other events as well. I've had the same question asked about September 11th, but it was basically this: where was God in the Holocaust? And the question is, how could a God of love and a God who's all powerful, how could a God like that allow something that bad to happen? And you could say the same thing about, how could there be a God who allows September 11th to happen? How could there be a God who allows a pandemic like the coronavirus to happen? And really the best answer to that question, well, there's a lot of good answers. And oftentimes when people say, where was God on September 11th? I usually answer by saying the same place he was on September 12th and the same place he was on September 10th. But maybe a little bit more, a more developed answer would go like this: if there's no God, then there can't be any moral evil. There can't be anything bad with the Holocaust. Okay, if there's no God, then there's no meaning to life. If there's no God, that's how we justify things like abortion and things like euthanasia. If there's no God, then terrible tragedies that happen can't really be tragedies, because if there's no meaning to human life, then there's no value to it. If there's no God, then human life doesn't have it. It doesn't matter. Okay, if you and I are nothing more than just cosmic accidents, we're nothing more than blobs of protoplasm who just kind of accidentally walked out of the slimy abyss in the ocean one day, then the Holocaust can't be a tragedy. If we're nothing more than just cosmic accidents, we don't have a divine creator, we don't have any meaning derived from our creator, we're not created in the image of God, then things like September 11th and, World War I, World War II, pandemics like the coronavirus, they're not really tragedies, because in order to be a tragedy, you have to have a value to human life. But if human life is meaningless, then you can't have such a thing as a tragedy or such a thing as a terrible accident. So for something to be tragic, there has to be a value to it. There has to be a foundation for ultimate meaning. So when we look at things like the Holocaust or 9/11, if those things are bad, and we deep down, we feel that those things are bad, then guess what? There has to be a God who gives meaning to that which is good and that which is bad. Okay, and that's kind of what Immanuel Kant was getting at when he said, if there's no heaven, then, there's no meaning. What we're doing here is absolutely worthless. I can remember one of the first pastor I ever worked for, Earl Palmer, out in Seattle. He had a way of putting it this way. He said, you can't understand the good news of the gospel until you first understand what the bad news is. And that was kind of his way of saying, of justifying and explaining about why, once in a while, you've got to tell your congregation what the bad news is. And one of my great frustrations in visiting other churches and visiting a lot of different denominations is that the ministers in them are so afraid to tell people about sin. They are so afraid to tell people that they're sinful and that, without Christ, they're on a one-way ticket to hell. And that's kind of where we've come in our society right now, where we don't believe that sin is as serious a problem as we somehow think it is. We don't believe that our sin is really that sinful. I heard a quote this morning when I was listening to one of my podcasts that went something like this: if saving you and me from the penalty of our sins wasn't that big a deal, if it wasn't that hard to do, then somebody other than Jesus probably couldn't have done it. God did not need to send his one and only begotten son to do something if it really wasn't that hard. And so that kind of, one of the reasons I appreciate Reformed theology, and one of the reasons I became a Presbyterian minister, even though I grew up as a Baptist, is because to me it seems like Presbyterians, and by that I mean kind of traditional conservative Presbyterians, they're really the only ones who historically have taken the issue of sin seriously. They're the only church I know of that has really understood how sinful sin can actually be. And in turn, it's out of that recognition that we understand how good the good news actually is of Jesus's work in our lives. So what's the comfort in all of this? What's the comfort that we can find when it comes to life after death? Well, really the comfort that we find in believing in life after death and being able to endure sometimes and handle tremendous suffering really comes in two places. It comes in the teaching of Jesus, and it comes in the work of Jesus. There's probably no better place to find an example of Jesus's teaching on comfort than in the 14th chapter of John. Now that section of John's gospel is kind of intertwined around one specific night. It's the Maundy Thursday of Holy Week. And Jesus has had he's gone to the upper room. He's had the Last Supper. And a vast majority of John's book is dedicated to just that one night. It's the Thursday night before Jesus's crucifixion. And Jesus says a lot of things during that night, and John records all of them. And one of the things that Jesus talks about, and he starts talking about it actually in chapter 13, he starts talking about how very soon the Romans, in conjunction with the Pharisees, they're going to come and arrest him. And very quickly, he's going to be crucified at the hands of the Romans. And so you can imagine, these disciples, they're all gathered together. They followed Jesus for the better part of 3 years. And suddenly he tells them that he's about to be put to death. And so it's understandable that these disciples are pretty upset at that news. And his disciples are, and he says, where I'm going, you can't follow. And it's in kind of response to this, to a question in chapter 13 that Peter asks, where are you going? And in response to that question, where are you going, asked by Peter, Jesus opens up chapter 14 with these words. He says this, let not your hearts be troubled. Now, let's just stop there for a second. The reason that Jesus says that is because their hearts are troubled, and for good reason. Jesus makes this statement, and he doesn't come out on stage and simply say, hey, here, guys, here's the beginning of my lecture. But instead there's a context to what Jesus says in chapter 14. And of course, that context is what happens earlier in chapter 13. And in chapter 13, we see these words in verse 22. It says that after saying these things, in other words, after telling his disciples what was going to happen, in verse 21, it says, after saying these things, Jesus was troubled in his spirit. Now, isn't that kind of an interesting admission by the writer John, the Apostle John, where he says that the text in verse 21 of chapter 13 says that Jesus was troubled in his spirit. But then at the very beginning of chapter 14, which is just, less than 30 seconds later, Jesus is telling his own disciples, don't be troubled in spirit. And of course, this isn't Jesus being aloof, kind of standing there aloof like a preacher who in the front of the congregation who says on the one hand this, on the other hand that. He's not telling his people not to worry about the church finances or anything like that. But he himself is extremely preoccupied. And so what is it that Jesus is troubled about in chapter 13? Well, it comes in that context where he says, and here he's speaking about Judas, he says, one of you is going to betray me. And he goes on to predict the subsequent denial of Peter, which happens 3 times that same night. Then he predicts that he's going away, and where he's going, that his own disciples can't come. They can't follow him. And of course, that would have been very startling to Jesus's disciples, because Jesus is now talking about a legitimate separation. And of course, that's one of the things that it's hard to deal with when we talk about the death of a loved one. It's not so much the loss as much as it is the separation. We don't want to deal with separation when it comes to suffering and when it comes to death. I even see the same thing in the story of Elijah and the widow of Zarephath. If you know that story in the Old Testament, Elijah shows up and her son dies. And Elijah says, give him to me. And the widow, the mother of the son, she's reluctant. She doesn't want to let go of her son's body. But Elijah prods her a little more. And eventually she's willing to do so because she thinks that there's a possibility. She thinks that there's a hope that her son may live again. And every minister, myself included, has been in a hospital room when a person has breathed their last and all the machines go off. You kind of see the flat line of the EKG machine, of the heart monitor. There's no more heartbeat going. And inevitably, one of the most common things that happen is that the family members who are still there in the room, they will hold on to that person's hand. They'll hold on to their arm. There's a reluctance, even in the midst of death, even though we know that the person's spirit is no longer there. There's a reluctance to let go, even in a situation like that. And even in the liturgy that you often see in a memorial service or in a funeral, the whole ceremony, the whole liturgy is often designed to help the people who are still there to let go from that which they're clinging to. So let me get back to John's gospel here. So in verse 34 of chapter 13, Jesus says this: "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." Now, that's probably the most detailed and probably the most significant group of sentences that Jesus ever stated on the subject of love. Okay. And the funny part, and again, here comes Peter, and his nickname is Foot in the Mouth Peter, because he has such a tendency to not quite grasp what Jesus is talking about. And he has a tendency to kind of stick his foot in his mouth all over the place. And so right after Jesus gives this great discourse, this great teaching on the subject of love, Peter's response is this. In the very next verse, he says, "Where are you going?" So in other words, he completely ignores what Jesus just said about the subject of love. And his only focus is on what Jesus has said about not being with them anymore. And so Peter, and again, I sometimes wonder if maybe Peter's mind didn't kind of flash back to the Sea of Galilee, where 3 years before that, his whole life was turned upside down by two very simple words. It's when Jesus went up to him and said, "Follow me." That's all that Peter, and Peter hears those words, and guess what? That's all that Peter did for 3 whole years. And it wasn't just following Jesus in terms of following his teaching, adapting Jesus's type of lifestyle. It was a literal following. It was following Jesus in the physical sense. He didn't just follow Jesus metaphorically, which he did as well, but he followed him in the physical. He went everywhere Jesus went is where Peter went. And now Jesus is saying, you can't follow me. And so Jesus has put almost a temporal prohibition on Peter's desire to follow him. And that's the context of what comes here in chapter 14, where he says, "Let not your hearts be troubled." And then he goes on, he says, "Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you, if we're not so, what I have told you, that I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also." Now, that's probably one of the most comforting passages in the whole Bible, but that's the most comforting thing in this whole passage, is that it's in the middle. In the middle of it is this statement that should be on the lips of every Christian. Okay, notice where Jesus says, "If it were not so, I would have told you." When I go to the hospital, when other ministers go to the hospital, you're going to a place that often deals with suffering and death. You're going to a place that probably sees more suffering, more death than any other building that you know of. And one of the biggest problems in hospitals that I've often run into is something that I would call false hope, where people who want to believe in hope. We want to believe that there's a relief or an end to our suffering. But there comes a place for many where that hope oftentimes runs out. And it's then that they're open to, kind of charlatans and con men and crooks who will take them in every type of direction. And that's kind of what Jesus is saying to his disciples. He's saying, "Look, guys, I'm not a charlatan. I'm not a witch doctor. I'm not some kind of, magic voodoo doctor who's got a magic, bottle of castor oil that's going to fix every problem." He basically says, there's nothing I haven't told you that didn't come directly from my Father in heaven. Okay. In other words, everything I've told you up to now has been direct from heaven itself. And so he's basically saying, I would have never allowed you guys to indulge in superstitious fantasy. Jesus is not going to give us a false hope and build up our expectations only for us to be embarrassed and ashamed at some later time. You know, and that's one of the, to be honest, that's one of the reasons I kind of encourage parents not to let things like belief in Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny or sometimes some of these fantasy related ideas. I kind of encourage parents not to let those go on too long. Just because I don't think it's ever a good idea to lie to children. And Jesus is kind of saying that as well. He's saying everything he's told you is not make believe. It's not fantasy. He's not telling us stories just to kind of like we tell the kid. We don't, like we tell kids stories about Santa Claus in order to get them to behave around December. But Jesus is saying that there's none of that. Okay. He's basically saying, if it were not so, I would have told you that. So he's not going to give us false hope. He knows where he's going, and he knows that he's going to prepare a place for us. And there's coming a day when he's going to call you and I home to be in that place. So when Jesus speaks about life after death, he's not in the same conundrum as Hamlet was. Okay, remember when Hamlet talked about life after death, he talked about it as the undiscovered country. He was admitting he didn't know what was there. But Jesus is different. He doesn't have Hamlet's problem. He knows what he's talking about. He's not guessing. He doesn't speak in terms of speculation. He knows what he's talking about because he knows what heaven is talking about. He speaks as one having authority. So in this case, Jesus just doesn't talk the talk, but he also walks the walk as well. He understands what heaven is going to be like for you and for me. And so he demonstrates that he demonstrates what indeed he's declared with his own lips. And we see that Jesus makes a promise that he's going there to prepare a place. So all this time, while Jesus has been in heaven, he's been preparing a place for you and I to come and join him. And that's the example of Jesus in his work. So we have the words of Jesus in John 14. We have the continuing work of Jesus in heaven right now on your behalf and on mine as well. Let me stop right there and wrap it up. I hope to have one more session available next week, and that'll be number 5, and that'll be the end of our series on this subject. But it's been a great session to kind of think about what's in store for us when it comes to the life after death. What is waiting for us when it comes to heaven? Do we think that some of the descriptions that are found in the Bible, especially the book of Revelation, do we think that those are literal descriptions? Are they metaphorical descriptions? I've often joked that one of the most common descriptions of heaven is a place where you and I sit around on a cloud and just play a harp all day. And I've joked with people that for me, that wouldn't be heaven, that would be hell. So I certainly hope that it's more than that. But regardless, it's going to be something that I think is going to be a surprise to many of us. But one thing that won't be a surprise, I don't think, and that is we won't be surprised by the character of the Jesus that we find there. And this is why, because the Jesus that we're going to meet in heaven, the Jesus that we're going to see in heaven, is the same Jesus that we've known all along during our walk in the here and now. The Jesus who has walked alongside of us, who's held our hand, who's held us up in his arms oftentimes when we've needed it. That's going to be the same Jesus that we're going to meet in heaven. And so in many ways for the Christian, I'm not sure there's really any big surprises when it comes to heaven, because the Jesus that we meet there is the one that we've known all along. Hallelujah and amen. Thanks again for listening. This has been another session on suffering in the Christian life, brought to you by Brad Klostreich and Palm City Presbyterian Church. I look forward to seeing you again soon on this same YouTube channel. Have a great day. Bye-bye.